They thought no one would say a word. In a quiet Montana diner, a disabled woman was shoved to the floor while everyone looked away. No cameras, no witnesses willing to speak, just laughter and silence. Then the door opened. A 45-year-old man in a worn brown leather jacket stepped inside a German shepherd at his side. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. But within minutes, knives were drawn, lies were told, and power began to panic. What happened next would expose corruption, test loyalty, and prove that silence is broken by those who've already faced war. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Early autumn settled over the Montana mountains with a cold that arrived without asking. A thin gray sky pressing low against pine-covered slopes and empty roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Pine Ridge Diner sat alone off the highway. Its windows fogged its neon sign, flickering like a tired promise that someone was still inside waiting. Laura Mitchell paused outside the door longer than necessary, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn canvas bag. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet, guarded dignity that had once belonged to a different life. She was tall, naturally slender, her posture still elegant despite the stiffness in her spine that never truly left. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a practical low knot strands, already slipping loose from the wind. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the cold, and her eyes, soft hazel, held a constant alertness shaped by pain and disappointment. 6 months earlier, a workplace accident at a timber mill had crushed 2 vertebrae and ended her ability to stand for long periods. What it had not crushed was her need to survive. She pushed the door open. Inside the diner smelled of grease-burnt coffee and old wood. A handful of locals occupied the booths, truck drivers with weathered faces, a retired couple sharing pie, a waitress moving slowly with the fatigue of someone who had worked the same floor for decades. Laura adjusted the brace hidden beneath her coat and stepped carefully inside, each movement measured. She was here for one reason, the rumor that Pine Ridge Diner needed part-time help, something seated, something quiet, something that might cover rent and medication if she was careful enough not to look weak. Near the far window sat Evan Caldwell and 3 of his friends. Evan was 28, clean-cut in an effortless way that came from never having to struggle. He had sharp features, a square jaw usually softened by a confident grin, short blonde hair styled without thought, and clear blue eyes that carried entitlement more than curiosity. He wore an expensive jacket, unsuited for the cold designer boots, untouched by mud, and the careless posture of someone who believed the room existed for his comfort. His father owned half the commercial property in the county. Evan made sure people remembered that without ever saying it out loud. His friends laughed loudly, voices bouncing off the walls, mocking the diner's decor, the food, the locals, anything that wasn't them. Laura tried to pass quietly behind their table. The aisle was narrow. She slowed, concentrating, placing her weight carefully. Evan noticed her then. His gaze flicked down, not with concern, but with calculation. As she stepped forward, he stretched his leg just enough to catch her boot. The fall happened fast and slow at the same time. Laura's foot clipped her balance, vanished, and the brace failed to compensate. She hit the floor, hard palms, scraping tile pane, exploding up her spine in a familiar, blinding wave. The sound echoed through the diner, sharp and final. Conversations died. Forks froze mid-air. No one stood. No one spoke. Laura stayed still for a heartbeat too long, fighting the instinct to curl inward. Heat burned behind her eyes, not just from pain, but humiliation. She pushed herself onto one knee breath, shaking aware of every pair of eyes on her back, and none of them willing to meet her gaze. Evan laughed softly, not loudly enough to be challenged, just enough to be cruel. The bell above the diner door chimed. Daniel Brooks stepped inside. At 45, Daniel looked like a man shaped by winters and worse things. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a build that spoke of strength worn down rather than displayed. His face was angular, marked by time and restraint, with a short, rough beard beginning to gray and deep-set eyes the color of old steel. He wore a thick, dark brown leather jacket cracked at the seams, a red and navy flannel beneath it, faded jeans, worn thin at the knees, heavy leather boots built for cold ground, and a gray wool scarf wrapped once around his neck. He moved with the quiet economy of someone who never wasted motion. At his left side walked Max. Max was a full-grown German shepherd, nearly 8 years old, black and tan, powerful, without excess. His coat was dense, well-kept, his ears alert, his amber eyes scanning the room with controlled focus. He did not pull on the leash. He did not bark. He carried himself with the discipline of training earned through repetition and trust. He stopped when Daniel stopped. Daniel took in the room in seconds. The silence, the frozen waitress, the young woman on the floor, pain etched across her face. The man by the window with his legs still half extended, his smile not yet faded. Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, something old and deliberate. Max felt it immediately. A low growl vibrated in his chest, barely audible, more warning than threat. Laura looked up then and saw them. The man and the dog framed by the door, the outside cold spilling in behind them. For reasons she could not explain, her breathing slowed. Daniel did not speak. He did not rush forward. He stood still, one hand resting lightly at his side, the other holding the leash with relaxed control. His gaze locked onto Evan Caldwell's. Evan straightened slightly, his laughter fading as he realized, perhaps for the first time that morning, that the room no longer belonged to him. The diner remained silent. The moment stretched, fragile and electric, as two lives shaped by very different kinds of power collided without a single word being spoken. Cold air lingered inside Pine Ridge Diner, trapped between old wood and frozen silence, as if the building itself had forgotten how to breathe. Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, boots planted firmly on the worn tile, the weight of the room settling onto his shoulders in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. He had seen this stillness before on desert roads, in ruined villages, in moments right before everything went wrong. It was the silence that followed cruelty, not because people agreed with it, but because fear had taught them to look away. Laura Mitchell was still on the floor, one knee bent awkwardly beneath her, one hand braced against the cold tile. Pain rippled through her spine in dull, relentless waves, but worse than the physical ache was the shame burning in her chest. She hated how small she felt in that moment, hated the way her body betrayed her at the worst possible times. When she lifted her eyes again, she found Daniel kneeling in front of her. Up close, he smelled faintly of leather wool and cold air. His movements were slow, deliberate, designed not to startle. His face, lined and weathered, softened slightly as he met her gaze. "Don't rush," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, the kind that carried authority without volume. "Tell me where it hurts." Laura swallowed, surprised by the question. People usually assumed they already knew. "My back," she said, her voice strained. "And my leg." Daniel nodded once, already assessing her posture, the way she favored one side, the tension in her shoulders. He offered his arm, not pulling, simply waiting until she chose to take it. With effort and embarrassment tangled together, Laura accepted the help and allowed him to guide her onto the edge of a nearby chair. Across the diner, Evan Caldwell watched the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. He leaned back in his booth, one arm draped carelessly over the seat, the other lifting his coffee mug, as if to toast the moment. "Careful," he said loudly, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want her tripping again. Some people just aren't built for public spaces." His friends snickered, glancing around to see who might challenge him. No one did. Daniel straightened slowly. He did not look at Evan immediately. Instead, he adjusted Laura's coat, making sure the brace beneath it wasn't twisted his hands, respectful, professional. Only when she nodded to show she was stable did he turn. His eyes met Evan's at last, calm and unblinking. "You owe her an apology," Daniel said, his voice unchanged. Evan laughed outright now, the sound sharp and ugly. For what, he replied? "Gravity." He stood tall and confident, the expensive jacket stretching across his shoulders. At 28, Evan was used to rooms bending around him. He had never learned the difference between being feared and being respected. "She should watch where she's going," he added, stepping closer. "People like her slow everyone down." Laura felt something snap inside her. Not courage exactly, but exhaustion. "I didn't fall," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You tripped me. I just want you to admit it." For a split-second, surprise flickered across Evan's face. He hadn't expected resistance. The moment passed, quickly replaced by irritation. "You're making a scene," he said, and before anyone could react, he shoved her shoulder. Laura fell again, harder this time. Pain shot through her spine, stealing her breath. A sharp gasp escaped her as she hit the floor. The room seemed to tilt. Max moved instantly. The German Shepherd stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Laura and Evan, his body a solid wall of muscle and fur. He did not bark. He did not lunge. His ears flattened slightly, his amber eyes locked on Evan with focused intensity. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like a warning shot. Daniel's hand tightened on the leash, a silent command transmitted through years of trust. Evan froze for half a heartbeat, then scoffed, masking unease with bravado. "Get that dog away from me," he snapped, though he did not step closer. His hand slid into his jacket pocket. The diner seemed to shrink, walls closing in as the metallic glint of a folding knife appeared in his grip. Evan's smile returned sharper now. "You think some old guy and his mutt scare me?" Daniel moved. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. He stepped inside Evan's reach, his left hand striking Evan's wrist with precise force, his right hand controlling the elbow, twisting just enough to break balance without breaking bone. The knife clattered to the floor, skidding beneath the table. Evan yelped, shock overtaking arrogance, as Daniel guided him face first against the booth, pinning him there with controlled pressure. "Stay still," Daniel said calmly, his breath even. Evan struggled briefly, then stopped, his confidence draining away. By the time the sound of sirens cut through the mountain air, Daniel had already stepped back. Evan slumped into the booth, clutching his wrist, his face pale with anger and disbelief. Max returned to Daniel's side at a quiet command, sitting perfectly still, eyes alert. The police arrived quickly. 2 officers entered, hands already resting near their belts, eyes scanning for threats. One of them, Officer Mark Jensen, was in his late 30s, broad and thick-necked, with a buzz cut and a perpetually tired expression. He took in the scene, his gaze landing first on Evan, then on Daniel, then on Max. "What happened here?" Jensen asked. Evan spoke first, his voice loud and practiced. "He attacked me," he said, pointing at Daniel. "Him and that dog. I was just sitting here." His friends nodded eagerly. Laura tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Moments later, the Caldwell family arrived. Richard Caldwell. Evan's father entered with measured steps, a tall man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the cold confidence of someone accustomed to control. His tailored coat contrasted sharply with the diner's worn interior. He didn't look at Laura. He didn't look at Daniel. His attention went straight to the officers. "My son is hurt," he said, his voice smooth. "I expect this handled properly." The shift was immediate. Jensen's posture stiffened. He turned back to Daniel. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back." Daniel complied without resistance. The cuffs clicked shut, metal biting into his wrists. Max stood ears back now, a soft whine escaping his throat, as another officer reached for his leash. "The dog is coming with us," Jensen said flatly. Laura watched in horror as Daniel was led away. Max pulled after him, the leash taut between them. "He was protecting me," she whispered, her voice lost in the noise. No one answered. As the diner emptied and the cold rushed back in, the story had already begun to change. A thin snow began to fall over the Montana foothills that night, soft and indifferent, covering the roads in silence, as Daniel Brooks sat alone in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and cold steel. The room was small, windowless, lit by a fluorescent light that hummed just loudly enough to keep sleep away. Daniel sat on the narrow bench, wrists uncuffed now, but still aching, shoulders heavy beneath his worn, brown leather jacket, scarf folded neatly beside him. At 45, he had learned to endure confinement. But this was different. This was not an enemy battlefield. This was home. He replayed the diner over and over in his mind, every angle, every sound. The way Laura Mitchell's breath caught when she hit the floor. The way Evan Caldwell's smile sharpened instead of fading. Daniel had lived long enough to know that truth did not win by default. Truth needed witnesses, and witnesses needed courage. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself the way he had been trained to do under fire. Anger would not help him. Precision might. Across town, Laura sat at the small table in her rented room, the heater clicking unevenly beside her. The pain in her back had not eased, but she ignored it, fingers wrapped tightly around a mug of lukewarm tea. Her reflection in the darkened window startled her. She looked older than 32 tonight. Her normally composed features were drawn, her hazel eyes rimmed red from exhaustion and fear. She had spent the evening answering questions from officers who had already decided what they wanted to hear. She knew that look. She had seen it before, when insurance adjusters smiled kindly while preparing to deny her claims. Daniel's face rose unbidden in her mind. The calm in his voice. The way he never raised it. The way he stood between her and danger without asking permission. Laura pushed herself upright despite the ache and reached for her coat. Silence had cost her too much already. Thomas Reed's office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building near the courthouse, a place that smelled of old paper and cedar polish. When Laura entered the next morning, she half expected to be turned away. Instead, she was greeted by a man who looked like he belonged to a different era. Thomas Reed was in his early 70s, tall but stooped slightly with age, his frame lean beneath a threadbare tweed jacket. His hair was thick and white, combed neatly back, his face deeply lined, but alert eyes a sharp blue that missed nothing. He moved slowly, but there was intention in every step, the kind born from decades of choosing words carefully and never wasting them. He listened without interrupting as Laura told her story. She described Evan Caldwell's shove the knife, the dog, the way the room had gone silent. Thomas folded his hands atop the desk, nodding once or twice, his expression unreadable. When she finished, Laura added quietly, "I can't pay you much. Maybe nothing. I just can't let them turn him into something he's not." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then leaned back. "I didn't ask about money," he said. "I asked about truth." He stood and extended his hand. "I'll represent him." By noon, the local news cycle had already made up its mind. Headlines scrolled across phones and televisions. Altercation at Pine Ridge Diner leaves. Man injured. Another followed, former soldier detained after violent incident. Daniel's military service, once a source of pride, was repackaged as menace. Photos pulled from public records showed him unsmiling eyes shadowed. The word dangerous appeared more than once. The Caldwell family's influence moved quietly, but efficiently, smoothing edges, directing narratives, deciding whose voice carried weight. Daniel was released late that afternoon, pending further investigation. He stepped out into the cold with stiff joints and a deeper stiffness behind his eyes. Max was not with him. The empty space at his side felt wrong, like a missing limb. He stood for a moment under the gray sky, breathing in the mountain air, reminding himself that panic served no purpose. His truck waited where he had left it, dusted with snow. He climbed inside and sat without starting the engine, hands resting on the wheel. That was when he remembered the gas station. The image surfaced slowly, unforced. Across the street from Pine Ridge Diner, a small, aging gas station sat at the corner, its canopy lights humming faintly. Daniel recalled the angle of the building, the placement of the pumps, the way the security camera had been mounted high on the corner, angled outward toward the road. He closed his eyes, reconstructing the scene with the same mental discipline he had once used to memorize hostile terrain. The camera would have had a clear line of sight through the diner's front windows. Clear enough. A spark of cautious hope ignited, quickly tempered by reality. Cameras failed. Files disappeared, especially when the wrong people were involved. Laura returned to Pine Ridge Diner the next morning, moving carefully, her posture guarded. She ordered coffee she barely touched and waited until the lunch rush faded. The waitress from before, a woman named Margaret, with tired eyes and graying hair pulled into a tight bun, wiped down the counter nearby. Laura leaned closer. "Across the street," she said quietly. "The gas station. Do you know if their cameras work?" Margaret paused, glancing towards the window. "They used to," she murmured. "Owner upgraded them last year after a break-in." She hesitated, then added, "But folks like the Caldwells don't like surprises." That night, Daniel sat in his truck outside the gas station, engine off, lights dark. Snow crunched under passing tires. He watched the camera, watched the office window, watched people come and go. His instincts warned him not to rush. Evidence was only useful if it survived long enough to be heard. He pulled his scarf tighter around his neck, the cold biting through the leather jacket, and waited. Inside the diner, the story had already changed again. Evan Caldwell's version was now the only one being repeated publicly. The knife had become an afterthought. The dog, a threat. Daniel the aggressor. Daniel knew better. Somewhere captured without opinion or loyalty, the truth might still exist on a hard drive, spinning quietly, unaware of the weight it carried. The question was whether it would still be there when someone finally dared to ask for it. Snow fell heavier over the Montana Valley the morning the truth finally found its footing. Thick flakes drifting past the courthouse windows, like quiet witnesses that could not be bribed. Daniel Brooks stood outside the building with his hands in the pockets of his worn brown leather jacket, gray wool scarf pulled high against the cold, his breath steady despite the weight pressing against his ribs. He had faced firefights with less uncertainty than this. War had rules. Courts had narratives. He was not alone, though few would have noticed at first glance. Across the street and down the steps, men lingered who did not look like much to the untrained eye, just middle-aged locals in plain jackets and boots. But Daniel knew them instantly. These were the men who had once shared rations and silence with him, who had learned to read danger in the smallest shift of air. They were older now, scarred in ways that did not show easily, but the discipline remained. There was Marcus Hale, tall and heavy-set, his beard shot through with gray, a former infantry sergeant whose calm demeanor had been forged after surviving an IED that killed half his unit. There was Luis Moreno, lean and sharp-eyed, his dark hair cropped short, a former combat medic who had learned early that hesitation cost lives. And there was Owen Price, broad-shouldered with a permanent crease between his brows, a former communications specialist whose distrust of authority began the day a command decision buried the truth of a failed operation. None of them spoke to Daniel. They did not need to. They were here because some debts were never settled. The gas station footage had almost been lost. Marcus had noticed the service truck parked behind the building the night before the scheduled system upgrade. Luis had talked his way into the office with a smile that never reached his eyes, distracting the attendant long enough for Owen to pull the data. It had taken minutes. The file had been copied, verified, backed up twice. By the time the Caldwell family's influence reached the station, the truth no longer lived in just one place. Inside the courthouse, Laura Mitchell sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She wore a simple coat, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her posture careful but composed. The pain in her back pulsed faintly, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still standing. When Daniel entered, their eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod, nothing more. It was enough. Evan Caldwell sat across the aisle, flanked by his attorney, and his father, Richard Caldwell, who leaned back with practiced ease, silver hair, immaculate tailored suit, unwrinkled by consequence. Evan looked different today. The swagger was dulled, replaced by a restless tension in his jaw, his knee bouncing beneath the polished wood table. He avoided looking at Daniel. Judge Helen Whitaker presided over the hearing, a woman in her early 60s with iron-gray hair cut short and eyes that carried the weight of decades on the bench. Her reputation was unremarkable in the way that mattered most. She followed the law, not the donors. She called the room to order, with a firm rap of her gavel, her voice measured and clear. The prosecution spoke first, repeating the now familiar version of events, words polished smooth by repetition. Daniel listened without reacting. He had learned long ago that truth did not need theatrics. It needed patience. Then Thomas Reed rose from his seat. The old lawyer moved slowly, leaning slightly on the edge of the table as he stood, but when he spoke, the room leaned with him. His voice was calm, unadorned, each word placed with care. He laid the foundation, simply timelines, angles, inconsistencies. He did not accuse. He invited attention. When he requested permission to present video evidence obtained from the gas station across from Pine Ridge Diner, a ripple moved through the room. The prosecution objected. Judge Whitaker raised a hand. "Let's see it," she said. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered once, then steadied. Grainy at first, then clear enough. The camera angle showed the diner's front windows, the reflection of passing headlights, the shapes moving inside. Laura shifted forward unconsciously, her breath catching. They watched Evan Caldwell extend his leg. They watched Laura fall. A murmur stirred, quickly silenced by the judge. The video continued. Evan's shove was unmistakable, the force evident even through glass. Laura hit the floor again. Daniel entered the frame. Moments later, his movements controlled, deliberate. Max stepped forward, placing himself between Laura and Evan. The dog did not attack. He did not lunge. He stood. Then came the knife. The metallic flash left no room for interpretation. Evan drew first. Daniel's response followed fast, precise, restrained. The disarm, the control, the retreat. Everything the prosecution had described as violence unfolded instead as protection. The screen went dark. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even the air seemed to pause. Richard Caldwell's face had drained of color. Evan stared straight ahead, his mouth slightly open, the confidence finally stripped away. The power that had filled the room at the start of the hearing had thinned, exposed as something fragile, dependent on darkness. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on the prosecution. "Do you have anything further?" she asked. The question hung unanswered. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. This was what truth felt like when it stood upright. Max, seated quietly at the back of the courtroom under supervision, lifted his head as if sensing the shift. His ears perked. His posture remained calm. Laura closed her eyes briefly, tears gathering but not falling. She had not imagined it. She had not exaggerated. She had not been invisible. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Power did not vanish that day, but it cracked, and through that fracture, the truth stood unafraid. Morning arrived cold and pale. The Montana sky washed thin with winter light as frost clung to rooftops and bare branches like a held breath finally released. Daniel Brooks stood outside the courthouse once more, this time without chains, without accusation, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in weeks, yet heavier in ways he could not fully explain. The judge's words still echoed faintly in his mind. Not guilty. 2 words clean and absolute, yet they did not erase what had happened. They only drew a line beneath it. Evan Caldwell had been formally charged, his family's influence no longer enough to shield him from consequences. Investigations were already unfolding quietly behind closed doors, touching officers and officials who had bent too easily when power leaned on them. Daniel listened as Thomas Reed explained the procedural next steps, nodding once, absorbing the information without visible reaction. At 45, Daniel had learned that vindication rarely arrived with celebration. It came with silence. Laura Mitchell waited near the courthouse steps, her posture careful but upright, her face calmer than Daniel remembered from that first day in the diner. She had changed in subtle ways. Her dark hair was still pulled back neatly, but there was less tension in her shoulders, less guardedness in her eyes. Pain remained part of her life, but it no longer defined every movement. She held herself as someone who had survived something and chosen not to shrink afterward. "I start Monday," she told him quietly when he approached. "Front desk at the community clinic. It's seated work." There was a trace of pride in her voice, restrained but genuine. Daniel nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "They'll be lucky to have you," he replied. Laura hesitated, then added, "I wouldn't have gone there if you hadn't stood up that day." Daniel shook his head slightly. "You stood up first," he said. "I just followed." Max appeared between them. Then leash-slack posture relaxed for the first time since Daniel could remember. The German shepherd's coat was clean again, his eyes clear, the tension that had lived in his body during separation finally gone. He pressed his head briefly against Daniel's thigh, a grounding weight, then sat at heel as if nothing had ever been out of place. Daniel rested a gloved hand on Max's neck, fingers curling into familiar fur, feeling the quiet reassurance of something that had never doubted him. The town moved on quickly, as towns often did. The diner reopened under new management, its windows scrubbed its silence, replaced with cautious normalcy. Conversations shifted. Names once spoken carefully were now avoided altogether. Daniel did not linger to hear them. He had never been good at staying where memory crowded the air. On his last morning in Pine Ridge, Daniel loaded his truck before sunrise. The brown leather jacket creaked softly as he moved the red and navy flannel beneath it, worn thin from years of use, the gray scarf catching the wind. He paused once standing still as Max waited beside him, watching the breath rise and fade in the cold. There was no ceremony in departure, no audience. That was how Daniel preferred it. Laura arrived just as he was closing the tailgate. She walked carefully across the frost-dusted gravel, her movements steady-controlled. She stopped a few steps away, respecting the space he kept instinctively. "I didn't come to say goodbye," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. No, she continued. "I came to say thank you, and to tell you that I won't waste what you did." Daniel studied her face, searching for the fear he had first seen there. It was gone, replaced by resolve. He nodded once. "That's all I'd ask." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the low, constant sound of something enduring. Max shifted tail, brushing the ground. Laura reached down and scratched behind his ears, her touch gentle but confident. The dog leaned into it, eyes half closing, then straightened again, alert but content. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble. He looked out the window at Laura one last time. There were no promises exchanged, no plans made. Some connections did not require maintenance. They existed solid and quiet, regardless of distance. He lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a brief acknowledgement. Laura nodded in return. As the truck pulled onto the road and the town receded behind him, Daniel felt no urge to look back. He drove east into the cold light, Max watching the passing landscape with calm attention. They were not heroes, not symbols. They were simply what they had always been, men and animals, shaped by duty moving on when the work was done. Somewhere behind them life resumed. Somewhere ahead it waited. Daniel did not seek recognition. He never had. He believed in something quieter than justice and stronger than fear. He believed that when the moment came when silence asked for obedience, someone had to refuse. Someone had to stand, and then just as quietly walk away. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It doesn't arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes the miracle is a person placed in the room at the exact moment injustice expects silence. This story reminds us that God often works through ordinary people who choose to stand when others look away. Daniel did not seek conflict or praise. He simply listened to the quiet voice that says, "This is wrong, and you must not ignore it." In our daily lives, we may never face a courtroom or a knife, but we face moments where fear asks us to stay silent and faith asks us to speak. Every small act of courage matters. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what it meant to you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, faith, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps wherever you are watching from.